Welcome to one of the fiercest battles ever fought in human history. To a small island of black volcanic sand, no bigger than a city, yet drenched in more blood than anyone could imagine. February 1945, the Battle of Iwo Jima. Here the Pacific turned into fire. Every inch of ground became a price measured in lives. The air burned with sulfur and gunpowder, and the ocean behind the Marines glowed red under artillery fire. They came with strength, 70,000 men, hundreds of ships, endless confidence, but the island waited for them in silence. Beneath that silence lay a fortress carved from lava rock, 21,000 Japanese soldiers, hidden in tunnels, invisible to the sky. When the first wave of Americans hit the beach, they thought they were landing on soft sand, until the ground swallowed their tanks whole. Engines screamed, treads spun helplessly, sand poured into every hinge and gear like smoke made solid. Radios crackled with panic. "We can't move. We can't move." And in that moment, victory seemed to sink with them. But in the middle of that chaos came something small, almost invisible. Not a new weapon, not a secret order, just an idea. A handful of engineers scavenged broken steel from wrecked bulldozers, welded it onto the front of a Sherman tank, and prayed it would hold. The next morning, when the tank roared again, the blade dug into the ash. It didn't sink, it pushed. It climbed. It carved a path where none existed. Behind it, men began to move again. One tank, one line, one heartbeat at a time. That crude piece of steel, born from desperation, built under fire, became the first dozer tank. It wasn't beautiful, but it worked. It changed how the Marines fought, how they advanced, how they survived. It was the smallest of innovations, yet it shifted the course of an entire war. No headline ever mentioned it. No general ever planned it. But without that blade, Iwo Jima might have been remembered very differently. Before we begin this story, stop for a second. Imagine the heat, the ash, the smell of iron and fear. Imagine standing on that beach watching two armies tear each other apart, one defending every inch of rock, the other inventing just to stay alive. Now ask yourself who truly had the advantage that day. The soldiers buried deep beneath the island, or the ones who learned to move the earth itself? Tell me your answer. Who would you have bet on, the defenders or the innovators? Because tonight, we'll find out who actually won, and how one small piece of steel decided it. Before the first wave even touched the sand, this island had already been chosen by fate. Iwo Jima, 8 square miles of black volcanic rock floating alone between the Marianas and Tokyo, a fortress halfway between heaven and hell. For the Americans, it was salvation, a place to land crippled bombers and launch the final blow against Japan. For the Japanese, it was everything left to defend. Lose Iwo Jima, and Tokyo itself would lie naked beneath the fire. Every week, B-29 bombers took off from Saipan, 400 at a time, loaded with bombs meant for the heart of Japan. And every week, too many never came home. Engines failed. Fuel ran dry. The Pacific swallowed them whole. The generals knew what had to be done: seize Iwo Jima, build an emergency airstrip, and turn this island into a shield for the airmen above. The mission had a name: Operation Detachment. For Japan, General Tadamichi Kuribayashi understood exactly what was coming. He knew he could not win, but he could make victory so costly that America would hesitate before touching Japanese soil. He ordered his men to dig, deeper than fear, deeper than reason. 11 miles of tunnels carved through stone. 1,500 bunkers connected by underground corridors. They would not fight on the beach. They would let the enemy come ashore and then bury them alive. When the orders reached the fleet, the sea itself seemed to hold its breath. Hundreds of ships assembled across the horizon, the largest armada ever gathered in the Pacific. Battleships like USS Idaho and USS Tennessee opened fire. For 3 straight days, the island burned beneath bombardment. Explosions lit the sky, ash rose like fog. Observers believed no one could have survived that inferno. But beneath the surface, the Japanese waited untouched, listening to the rain of steel from within their tunnels. Kuribayashi whispered to his men, "The enemy will think we are dead. Then they will come." February 19th, 1945. Dawn broke red over the Pacific. The first landing craft surged forward, cutting through smoke and foam. Inside, Marines clutched rifles slick with sweat. Some whispered prayers. Others stared ahead in silence. 5 days, they had been told. We'll take it in 5. But as the ramp doors dropped and the sand swallowed their boots, they realized that number meant nothing. The island was alive and it was waiting. The sand wasn't sand at all. It was ground lava, fine as ash, deep as water. Every step sank. Tanks rolled forward and disappeared into the earth. The sound of engines became screams. Tracks spun, digging deeper instead of climbing. Men cursed, pushed, pulled, trying to free machines that weighed 30 tons. Within minutes, the beach was jammed with steel corpses, tanks, half-buried trucks, overturned landing craft broken open like shells. The radio crackled, "We can't move, we can't move." From the heights of Mount Suribachi, the Japanese observers watched silently. Not a single shot fired. Not yet. Kuribayashi wanted them all ashore, all trapped before the real battle began. And then, at 09:05 a.m., the silence ended. Artillery erupted from beneath the ground. Mortars, machine guns, rockets, all at once. The sky tore open with thunder. The first wave of Marines vanished under smoke and fire. Commanders shouted orders that no one could hear. The beach turned red, and the sand drank it. Hours passed, and still the Marines couldn't see the enemy. They were fighting ghosts, voices in tunnels, flashes of fire from holes no bigger than a fist. The bombardment had done nothing. Every hill, every ridge, every crack in the rock was a gun pointed at the sea. The Americans advanced inches at a time, crawling, dragging the wounded, praying for cover that didn't exist. They called it Hell's Beach. And yet they didn't stop. They couldn't. There was nowhere to go but forward. By noon, the heat was unbearable. The volcanic ash reflected sunlight like a mirror. Marines stripped off gear just to breathe. Canteens ran dry. Cigarettes burned to the filter before they could take a second drag. The air tasted of metal. Gunfire came from every direction, sometimes from beneath their own feet. A flamethrower team tried to clear a bunker, only to realize it was connected to 5 more. The entire island was a machine built to kill. At sea aboard the command ship, USS Eldorado General Holland Smith listened to the radio transmissions, broken, frantic, desperate. Reports came in, all tanks disabled, engineers down, beach impassable. He paced in disbelief. 36 hours in, and we haven't moved a mile. He didn't know it then, but the plan had already failed. The terrain had done what the enemy could not. It stopped the greatest invasion force on Earth. Deep beneath the island, Kuribayashi marked the American positions on a map. His men had held. They had done exactly as ordered. But even as his strategy worked, he felt no triumph. He knew this battle would end with his death. And yet he wrote in his diary that night, "We fight not for victory, but to teach our enemy the cost of their ambition." Night fell. The wind turned cold. The fires along the beach glowed like a dying sun. Wounded men called out through the dark, their voices blending with the hiss of waves. Medics moved by touch, not sight. Engineers worked under flares, their torches sparking in rhythm with distant gunfire. Somewhere in the chaos, a mechanic picked up a piece of scrap metal, a curved panel ripped from a destroyed bulldozer, and turned it over in his hands. Maybe he said softly, "This could work." It was nothing yet just an idea. But in war, ideas are sometimes the only things that survive. That night, while artillery thundered and the earth trembled, a few men refused to stop thinking. They gathered steel bolts, welding rods, anything they could find. They worked by touch, by instinct, by stubborn hope. Sparks lit their faces like tiny stars, the smell of molten iron mixed with blood and gunpowder. They weren't building a weapon. They were building a chance. By dawn, the island was still burning. But something new had been born in the smoke. A crude metal blade bolted to the front of a Sherman tank. It looked wrong, crooked, uneven, handmade. But when the driver tested the engine, the tank moved forward. The blade cut through the ash, pushing the earth aside. It didn't sink. It climbed. It cleared a path. And in that moment, for the first time since the invasion began, hope moved with it. The men didn't cheer. They were too tired for that. But they watched wide-eyed as the machine crawled through terrain that had swallowed everything else. One whispered, "If that thing keeps moving, we might live." They didn't realize it yet, but that simple piece of steel built from desperation and scraps had just changed the course of the Pacific War. Before the fleet ever steamed toward Iwo Jima, the plan was drawn with maps and metrics, not poetry. The Americans called it Operation Detachment, a surgical move in a long campaign designed to shave days and lives off the air war over Japan. And every aspect was organized around one unglamorous need: runway space for crippled B-29s and radar stations to warn of incoming raids. The V amphibious corps trained, drilled, and rehearsed amphibious landings until maneuvers became muscle memory. Sailors, Marines, engineers, and aviators practiced the timing of waves, the sequencing of bombardment, the choreography of supply landings, all under the assumption that superior firepower and overwhelming numbers would break resistance quickly. Ships were assembled in unprecedented numbers: battleships, cruisers, destroyers, escort carriers, landing ships, and craft, each with detailed missions mapped down to firing sectors and timing windows. Aviation planned thousands of sorties to soften defenses, lay smoke, and support landings. Logistics were obsessive stocks of ammunition fuel. Medical supplies and replacement parts were calculated to sustain an advance long enough to build an emergency airstrip, and the Seabees were given blueprints and priorities: clear a strip, build revetments, and keep the supply line moving. They rehearsed for sand, surf, and flame. They trained on mock beaches, practiced unloading under simulated fire, refined methods to bring tanks from ship decks to shore, knowing that mechanized support would be essential to break inland, and assuming that once armor could move, the island would yield. Intelligence collected photographs, intercepted messages, and reports from the Pacific gave Washington a picture, but not the full truth. Aerial shots showed gun emplacements and pillboxes, but could not reveal the subterranean labyrinth the defenders were building. Commanders issued optimistic timetables: 5 days, some even said, and plans hardened into expectations. Yet each schedule carried a brittle assumption that the pre-landing bombardment would neutralize enough of the enemy to allow beachheads to expand. In short, the American plan was industrial: bring more people, more metal, more explosives, and build a runway before the island bled the invasion dry. On the other side, General Tadamichi Kuribayashi was not making similar assumptions. He had studied the maps and counted the odds, and he declared refusal to fight the kind of pitched battle the Americans expected on open sand. Kuribayashi's preparation was the inverse of the American playbook. Instead of meeting force with force on the beach, he burrowed his warfare into stone, into silence, into concealment. He ordered the transformation of Iwo Jima from an exposed volcanic mound into a subterranean fortress, miles of tunnels, interlinked bunkers, concealed artillery positions, and choke points designed to turn every American advantage into a liability. Concrete and steel camouflage and misdirection, stockpiled ammunition, and hidden embrasures, these were his tools. Patience and attrition were his strategy. He grasped that naval gunfire and airstrikes could tear up surface positions, but they could not root out defenders who lived beneath the earth. Therefore, his men prepared to endure bombardment and to strike when the invaders were most vulnerable. Kuribayashi's orders were precise and grim: no massed defensive lines on the beaches to be obliterated by pre-landing fire, but a scattering of decoy positions to entice and bog down. Then, when the enemy came in counterattacks and enfilading fire emerging from holes and vents no reconnaissance could easily find, he emphasized discipline and concealment. He taught units to fight independently, to vanish from bombardment, to re-emerge and strike. He turned caves and tunnels into hospitals, command posts, and reloading centers so that death on the surface would not end the fight below. Supply caches where buried ammunition moved into galleries, and firing apertures were angled and armored to survive overhead shelling. Engineers worked in secret, using the island's geology to their advantage on a scale that aerial photography could not record. Kuribayashi also altered the psychology of defense. He prepared men to die, but to make every death costly, hoping to exact a price that would slow American momentum toward the home islands. Both sides devoted special units and equipment to the task. The Americans organized amphibious tractors, LVTs, to cross surf and soft sand, outfitted Sherman tanks for landing, and stockpiled flamethrowers, demolition charges, wire cutters, and portable bridging materials. Naval crews rehearsed counter-battery techniques and shipboard fire control, while aviators planned close air support and isolation missions. The Seabees trained for immediate repair and runway construction, and logistics officers rehearsed the flow of materiel from carrier decks to beach dumps to forward supply points, every pallet crate and canteen accounted for in a chain meant to survive chaos. On the Japanese side, engineers dug not just for defense, but for deception, building false emplacements to draw fire, camouflaging positions under native vegetation, and bombed rubble, and ensuring that even where bombardment appeared to have succeeded, survivable positions remained. Each side's preparations reflected its worldview. American planners still believed in overwhelming force and tempo. Kuribayashi counted on concealment, attrition, and the moral shock of high casualties to shape outcomes. The contradictions in preparation created the battlefield's texture. One side rehearsed movement and supply, the other rehearsed delay and attrition, and each built contingencies for the unforeseeable. The Americans, anxious about losses from air crews ditching at sea, prioritized radar and emergency strips. Meteorological teams studied wind and surf patterns to schedule landings. Corps-level commanders planned secondary lodgements and push points inland in case primary beaches jammed. Meanwhile, the Japanese stockpiled food and fuel in subterranean caches, rotated men through cooler tunnel galleries to prolong endurance, and maintained strict radio silence to deny signals, intelligence, any easy confirmation of their positions. Both sides practiced improvisation in drills, sailors learning to recover men under fire, engineers learning to patch tanks on wet sand, because both understood that plans would break and only flexible execution would save lives. And yet, for all that planning, neither side prepared for every small human answer that might emerge in the moment. The scrap metal repurposed into a blade, the welder who stayed at his torch beyond exhaustion, the sergeant who nudged a commander to try a makeshift idea instead of waiting for orders. The American apparatus was vast and expensive and meticulously organized, but in the end, the battle's shape would depend as much on improvisation as on doctrine. The Japanese underground strategy could hold and kill, but it could not anticipate every countermeasure born from the grit of a single engineer. So both prepared, the Americans with ships and schedules, the Japanese with tunnels and tenacity, and both expected to see their preparations determine the outcome. Neither expected that at a crucial moment, ingenuity born of desperation would alter the equation. In the cold calculus of planners, the campaign's success was a ledger of tonnage, sorties, and manpower. In the real calculus of the beach, success would be measured in inches gained, medics saved, and a blade of steel that might or might not bite. Preparations could shape opportunity. They could allocate resources, position firepower, and marshal will, but they could not guarantee genius nor prevent improvisation. That tension between plan and human invention is what would decide whether the island became a springboard for invasion or a tomb of futility, and it is that tension we now follow into the machines, the workshops, and the hands that welded history into being. February 19th, 1945. Dawn rose pale and red over the western Pacific. From horizon to horizon, the sea itself seemed made of steel-gray ships, anchored in rows, engines humming, gun barrels pointing toward a smoldering dot of land. Iwo Jima. 8 square miles of volcanic ash, still trembling from 3 days of naval bombardment. Commanders aboard the flagship USS El Dorado watched through binoculars as the first rays of sunlight glinted off the black slopes of Mount Suribachi. Beneath that mountain, invisible to every lens, 21,000 Japanese soldiers waited, silent, buried, unbroken. At 0640, the last of the naval guns fell silent. The signal went up, a single green flare. Across the armada, loudspeakers barked, "Land the troops," and suddenly the still sea came alive. Dozens, then hundreds of landing craft dropped from transport ships, churning the surf into white foam. LSTs opened their mouths. LVTs crawled forward, and the first wave, nearly 9,000 men of the 4th and 5th Marine Divisions, began the longest ride of their lives. Engines roared. Spray whipped across helmets. Some men gripped their rifles so tightly their knuckles bled. Others stared at the volcanic ridges ahead, dark and sharp against the light. They had been told the island was all but destroyed, that no living thing could have survived the bombardment. But as they neared the beach, many felt the same uneasy silence that haunted veterans from Tarawa and Saipan. Silence in war is never mercy. It is the drawing of breath before the storm. At 08:59, the guns offshore lifted. For a brief heartbeat, the world held its breath. Then the first craft hit the sand. Marines leapt over the sides, splashing into waist-deep water, pushing toward shore under the weight of packs, rifles, flamethrowers, and fear. The sand looked firm, but it wasn't sand. It was crushed lava, fine as powder, bottomless as smoke. Every step sank. Every tank that followed bogged down. Within minutes, the neat choreography of invasion dissolved into chaos. For half an hour, nothing fired back. No machine gun, no mortar, not a single artillery shell. Officers waved their men forward. Photographers stepped onto the beach to record what looked like an easy victory. Bulldozers began to move supplies inland. Then, at 09:05, the island awoke. From the ridges above and the tunnels below, the Japanese unleashed everything at once. Mortars shrieked from invisible pits. Machine guns rattled from vents the size of fists. Artillery burst from the flanks of Suribachi shells, landing with terrifying precision among the crowded beachhead. The quiet became thunder. Men disappeared into fountains of black dust. Trucks flipped like toys. Radios crackled and died. "We're pinned, can't move, need smoke, need fire support." The beach turned into a furnace. The fine volcanic ash, kicked up by explosions, clung to sweat and blood, turning every man gray. LVTs burned in rows, their crews trapped inside. Engineers tried to dig foxholes, but the ash caved in faster than they could scoop. Medics crawled through the chaos, dragging the wounded into makeshift craters, marking the dead with rifles stuck upright in the sand. Above them, naval gunners tried to respond, but they couldn't see targets, only smoke and flashes. The Japanese were invisible. Kurabayashi's plan had worked perfectly. He had forbidden his troops to waste bullets on the first wave, had ordered them to hold fire until the beaches were full, until every tank, every man, every radio was in range. Now his artillery, hidden in tunnels that honeycombed the island, spoke with one voice. For the Americans, it was slaughter. By noon, more than 400 men were down, and the line had advanced barely 300 yards. Yet they kept coming. Wave after wave pushed through surf and smoke. By midday, the 5th Marine Division landed its reserve regiments. Tanks rolled forward again, their engines screaming exhaust vents glowing red. Some made it off the beach, carving narrow tracks through the ash. One crew welded a bulldozer blade onto the front of their Sherman, trying to clear paths for infantry. It looked absurd, a tank with a shovel, but it worked. Inch by inch, they pushed forward. On board the USS Eldorado, General Holland Smith listened to reports through static, heavy resistance. Tanks bogged, requesting airstrikes. He stared at the chart spread before him, a small black island surrounded by blue, and said softly, "This will take longer than 5 days." His aides said nothing. They already knew. That night, the beach glowed red, a reflection of burning fuel, phosphorus, and flesh. The smell was heavy, metallic, unforgettable. The cries of the wounded carried over the surf. In the darkness, Japanese infiltrators crept among the foxholes, tossing grenades, stabbing silently, vanishing back into tunnels before dawn. No one slept. Men sat clutching rifles, staring into the dark, whispering prayers that no longer sounded like words. Day 2 began with another bombardment, this time closer, harsher. Marine artillery rolled onto the shore, setting up behind dunes of ash. Tanks advanced in pairs, covering one another with fire. Flamethrowers swept across pillboxes, their liquid fire spilling into vents and crevices. The smell of burning concrete mixed with sulfur. Every cave had to be cleared by hand grenade, flame, smoke, silence. Behind them, the Navy's 16-inch guns thundered again, each shell shaking the earth. Still, progress was counted in feet, not miles. Kurabayashi's tunnel system allowed his soldiers to move unseen. A bunker destroyed in the morning would come alive again by afternoon. A ridge captured would erupt in fire that night. The Marines began to call the place Hell's Beach. By the 4th day, the line had reached the base of Mount Suribachi. The mountain rose like a claw, 550 feet of volcanic rock, honeycombed with guns and snipers. Every step uphill was met with grenades rolling back down. Every slope was mined, every cave defended. Yet on February 23rd, after fierce fighting, a small group from the 28th Marines began their climb. They carried a flag folded in a pack, small, faded, meant for a single photograph. The ascent took hours. Smoke drifted like mist, obscuring the path. Halfway up, they met fire from hidden caves, but they kept climbing. When they reached the summit, the island stretched beneath them, a vast graveyard of steel and ash. They planted the flag in the soil. From below, the fleet saw it rise, and 1,000 horns blared in salute. On the beach, men cheered through tears. It was not the end of the battle, but it was the first breath of hope. North of Suribachi, the fight only grew worse. The Japanese strongholds at Motoyama airfields number 1 and number 2 turned into killing grounds. The terrain was open but riddled with underground bunkers connected by tunnels that defied maps. Every attack meant walking into crossfire. Flamethrower teams advanced with engineers sealing caves one by one. Smoke turned the midday sun into a dull orange disk. The air trembled with heat. By early March, the Marines finally reached the central plateau. B-29 bombers began landing on newly repaired runways even as gunfire echoed from nearby ridges. The cost was immense. Of 70,000 Americans on the island, nearly a third were killed or wounded. The Japanese fought to the last man, obeying Kuribayashi's final order. Each one of you shall kill 10 enemies before you die. When ammunition ran out, they attacked with bayonets, swords, and bare hands. On the night of March 25th, the last defenders launched a desperate banzai charge, 300 men against tanks and machine guns. They broke through the front line, killed more than 100 Marines, and fell in a storm of fire. By dawn, it was over. The island that had burned for 36 days finally went quiet. When the flag rose again over the rebuilt airfield, the silence felt heavier than the gunfire that had preceded it. 7,000 Americans dead. Nearly every Japanese soldier gone. The black sand was soaked with history, and in that soil lay the truth of modern war. Victory was no longer about courage alone. It was about adaptation, about men who refused to stop thinking, even when surrounded by chaos. Somewhere amid the ruins, an engineer leaned against his battered dozer tank, the crude invention that had clawed paths through ash that had saved lives when no plan had worked. He didn't know it then, but that small innovation born of desperation, welded by human hands in hell, had helped turn the tide of the Pacific. And as the wind swept over Iwo Jima carrying the smoke out to sea, the island stood silent once more. An island of ghosts of heroes and of one small idea that refused to sink. The mountain had been there long before the war, a black cone of hardened lava rising 550 feet above the Pacific. To the Japanese, it was sacred ground. To the Americans, it was an obstacle that had to die. Mount Suribachi, the southern anchor of Iwo Jima, the eye of the storm. Whoever held it could see every inch of the beach below, and rain fire upon it. For days, Suribachi had watched in silence, its slopes burning under naval bombardment, its tunnels shaking with the thunder of shells. But when the Marines reached its base, they found that silence still alive, waiting. Kuribayashi had placed some of his best men there, engineers, machine gunners, and artillery crews, each sworn to fight to the last round. Inside the mountain, the Japanese had carved an underground fortress, galleries of rock, connected by shafts, each chamber hidden by steel doors and camouflage nets. On February 21st, the first assault began. Infantry companies advanced under covering fire from tanks and naval guns. The volcanic ash slid under their boots, making every step uphill a struggle. Machine guns erupted from the slopes, short, precise bursts, from holes barely wide enough for a barrel. The Americans replied with flamethrowers, the fire streaming into caves like liquid light. The air filled with smoke screams and the sharp metallic smell of burning stone. Every yard of ground cost lives. Caves that looked abandoned exploded without warning. Grenades rolled down slopes like pebbles. Snipers fired from vents in the rock, invisible even to spotters. The Marines fought in teams, one man firing one man, throwing one man, climbing, repeating the ritual of advance and fall, advance and fall. Naval shells thundered behind them, shaking the earth so hard that the men swore they could feel the mountain breathing back. By February 22nd, the base of Suribachi was surrounded, but the summit was still a fortress. Japanese soldiers inside the tunnels moved like shadows, shifting weapons from one gallery to another, using underground radio lines to coordinate fire. Every time the Americans broke through one entrance, fire erupted from three more. It was as if the mountain itself had a heartbeat, steady, relentless, defiant. Overhead clouds parted, and a new threat arrived. Japanese bombers flying from Chichijima and the southern home islands dove out of the sun. They targeted the U.S. fleet destroyers' transports and landing craft packed with supplies. Kamikaze pilots, their cockpits adorned with small flags and family photos, drove their planes into the ships below. The sky filled with streaks of flame. The USS Saratoga took 5 direct hits. The USS Bismarck Sea exploded, flames leaping hundreds of feet into the air. Men jumped into burning water, clinging to debris as fuel slicks ignited around them. The Pacific turned red again, not from dawn, but from fire. The fleet fought back. Anti-aircraft guns filled the sky with metal tracer rounds, weaving patterns like lightning. Gunners screamed coordinates. Pilots in Corsairs and Hellcats raced to intercept. But the Japanese attacks came in waves day and night, each more desperate than the last. More than 100 planes were destroyed in a single day, but even one hit could kill hundreds. Offshore medics pulled survivors from the sea, men with burns so deep they no longer felt pain, whispering prayers for ships that would never answer again. Back on the island, the battle for Suribachi raged without pause. Tanks fired point-blank into cave mouths. Engineers used demolitions to seal tunnels only for explosions to open new ones. The Marines began fighting with instincts alone, clearing one crevice at a time, counting grenades by touch. One squad advanced less than 50 yards in an entire day. The mountain was not giving up. February 23rd. Dawn, a sky the color of ash. The 2nd Battalion, 28th Marines began their final climb. They moved in silence, stepping over black stones slick with rain and blood. At halfway, they met resistance machine gun nests firing from holes camouflaged by moss and sand. The Marines advanced anyway. Flamethrowers roared, rifles cracked. Grenades bounced and exploded, echoing through the tunnels like thunder trapped in a cage. At 10:20 a.m., a small group reached the top. They looked around, nothing but smoke, rock, and the endless ocean stretching on every side. A corpsman pulled a folded flag from his pack. Another Marine found an iron pipe to serve as a pole. They tied the flag, raised it high. Below, the men on the beaches looked up and saw color for the first time in days. The ships offshore sounded their horns. For a moment, the island felt alive again. But even as the flag waved, fighting still raged, just yards away. Caves deeper inside the mountain refused to surrender. Some Japanese soldiers waited until nightfall, then emerged to fight hand to hand. Others, wounded beyond hope, triggered grenades inside their bunkers. When the mountain finally fell quiet, it wasn't peace, it was exhaustion. Out of roughly 2,000 Japanese defenders, barely 200 remained alive. The Marines stood on the summit, watching the smoke drift east toward the sea. Below them, the fleet burned on the horizon, the faint silhouettes of damaged ships rocking in the surf. The kamikaze attacks had cost the U.S. Navy dearly. 6 ships sunk, 19 damaged, hundreds of sailors lost. But the line held. The invasion continued. And from that mountaintop, with a single flag fluttering against the wind, the tide of the Pacific began to shift. When the sun set that day, Suribachi glowed red under the last light, as if still burning from within. The men who survived never forgot the sound, the echo of fire trapped in stone, the screams carried by wind, the roar of engines plunging from the sky. The mountain had taken everything from both sides, courage, steel, blood, and belief, and still it stood. Kuribayashi's plan had worked in spirit, if not in victory. His mountain had delayed an army, bloodied a navy, and forced the enemy to fight inch by inch. But what he could not stop was adaptation. American engineers, seeing the devastation from both land and air, began reinforcing the beaches, clearing wreckage with improvised tanks and bulldozers. The first makeshift dozer tank, the same small innovation born from desperation, began carving roads up the slopes of Suribachi. What men could not climb, the machine could move. From that point on, every new assault used those blades to clear debris, build cover, and open paths where the earth itself had become a weapon. That was how they reached the summit. That was how they planted the flag. In the end, Mount Suribachi became more than a battlefield. It became a monument, not just to victory, but to endurance. Not just to strength, but to the strange, fragile genius that survives inside chaos. And above it all, the flag still waved over the silence, the sea, and the graves of those who would never return. By the time Mount Suribachi fell, the island was only half taken. To the north lay a plateau of broken rock and ash, the final Japanese stronghold. The Americans called it the meat grinder. The Japanese called it nothing at all. They simply waited. The northern defenses were Kuribayashi's masterpiece, a labyrinth of tunnels, trenches, and fortified ridges, stretching from Motoyama Airfield No. 2 to the cliffs overlooking Kitano Point. It was here that the battle turned from victory to endurance, from tactics to survival. Every inch of ground was mapped by fire. Every crater, every ridge had a name that no map could print, names whispered by men who never left them. The first assaults began on February 27th. Artillery thundered from the fleet offshore, but by now the Japanese knew how to survive it. They vanished underground, letting the storm pass overhead. When the Marines advanced, the earth itself erupted, guns from unseen caves, mines triggered by tripwires, grenades dropped from vents. The air trembled with dust. The sun vanished behind smoke. Men crawled forward one by one through a landscape that looked more like the moon than the Pacific. Kuribayashi's command post sat deep beneath the northern plateau, a warren of steel-lined chambers lit by flickering lamps. Radio lines still connected him to a few scattered positions, and his voice remained calm. "Hold your fire until you can see their faces," he ordered. "And when you do, make every bullet count." He knew the end was coming, but he meant to make it last. Each day, the American lines moved only a few hundred yards. Marines attacked in teams of 3, one with a rifle, one with a flamethrower, one with demolition charges. They fought through interconnected tunnels that could not be mapped. A cave cleared in the morning would erupt again at dusk. Bodies lay where they fell, untouched, unburied, part of the terrain now. The ash swallowed everything. Air support circled endlessly overhead. Corsairs and Hellcats strafed the ridges, dropping napalm that turned night into day. The smell of burning fuel drifted for miles. Engineers moved behind the front using tank dozers to fill craters and push wreckage aside. Every path they cleared became a target. Every target cleared became another grave. By March 5th, the 3rd and 5th Marine Divisions had joined the assault. They pushed north past Motoyama Airfield No. 3, what was left of it, and into the last organized line of defense. The Japanese fought from blockhouses, reinforced with concrete and volcanic rock. Snipers used bodies as bait, firing a single shot, and then disappearing into tunnels. Mortars fell without pattern, without mercy. The Marines answered with everything they had, artillery, flame grenades, yet the resistance did not break. Above them, the sky came alive again. From Kyushu and the Bonin Islands, Japanese aircraft launched desperate sorties against the American fleet. Kamikaze pilots, many barely trained, dove into ships anchored off Iwo Jima. One by one, they found their marks: a destroyer crippled, an ammunition ship, a flame landing craft scattered like leaves. The USS Bismarck Sea sank in minutes. The USS Saratoga burned through the night. The horizon flashed with explosions, as if the sea itself were fighting back. The fleet's anti-aircraft guns tore the sky open. Tracer fire laced the clouds, shrapnel raining into the waves. Pilots shouted warnings, bandits inbound 5 o'clock high, before static swallowed their voices. Some of the suicide planes hit nothing but water. Others struck home, turning decks into infernos. From the beaches, Marines watched helplessly as fire climbed into the sky, thinking of friends they'd left aboard those ships. War had no front anymore, only flame. On land, the fight worsened. March 10th, rain fell for the first time in weeks. It mixed with ash and blood, turning the ground into black mud. The wounded lay half-buried, calling for medics who could not come. Flamethrowers hissed and failed in the damp air. Rifles jammed. Still, the Marines moved forward, crawling, climbing, dragging themselves through what was left of the island. By mid-March, Kuribayashi's northern line was collapsing, but not defeated. Ammunition was nearly gone. Food was gone. Many of his men fought with bayonets, others with shovels. Some carried only grenades, 2 for the enemy, 1 for themselves. The last radio message from the north crackled through on March 23rd. The enemy has reached the central caves. We are counterattacking with what remains. Tell the Emperor we have done our duty. 2 days later, the final battle began. Under cover of darkness, the remaining Japanese, perhaps 300 men, launched a last desperate assault on the 5th Marine Division's command post near Motoyama. They moved silently until the first shouts went up, then charged into the gunfire. Bayonets flashed, grenades burst, hand-to-hand combat filled the night. Machine guns jammed from heat. Men fought with knives, fists, helmets. By dawn, the attack was over. The ground was carpeted with bodies, American and Japanese alike. The surviving defenders detonated grenades among themselves rather than surrender. When the smoke cleared, there was no more battle to fight. The island was silent again, a silence heavy, absolute, unholy. The Marines walked among the ruins of what had been Kuribayashi's fortress. They found his command post empty, a pistol, a sword, a note written in a steady hand. I pray for the Emperor's safety. No one ever found his body. March 26, 1945. Iwo Jima was declared secure, but there was no celebration. The victory had no joy in it. Of the 21,000 Japanese defenders, only a few hundred had been captured alive. The rest lay buried in the tunnels they had built. American losses were staggering, nearly 7,000 dead, more than 19,000 wounded. Every yard of ground had been bought with lives. In the weeks that followed, engineers and Seabees worked tirelessly, clearing debris, paving runways, and transforming the Black Island into an airbase. Within a month, damaged B-29 bombers began landing, their crews stepping onto the same sand that had once been soaked in blood. The irony was bitter, but undeniable. The island that had cost so much life was now saving it. By war's end, more than 400 B-29s made emergency landings on Iwo Jima. 27,000 airmen came home because of that ground. And when they looked out the windows of their planes, they saw the same thing. Every Marine remembered the mountains still standing in the south, the northern ridges still scarred, and the endless sea beyond. That was the cost. That was the echo. A battle that began in fire and ended in silence, a victory measured not in triumph, but in endurance. When the bombardment finally ceased and silence drenched the island, Iwo Jima lay conquered yet wounded beyond words. The victorious flags flew overhead, but the shadows on the beaches told another story. The island had given everything men steel fire faith until nothing remained but ash and memory. In the end, the Americans claimed Iwo Jima on March 26, 1945. What began as a 5-day operation stretched into 36 days of hell. Of the roughly 21,000 Japanese defenders, only about 200 were captured alive. The rest perished in caves, tunnels, and suicide charges. The U.S. forces landed over 70,000 troops and suffered nearly 7,000 dead and over 19,000 wounded. Every yard of ground had been paid for in blood. Yet what was won was more than territory. 3 airfields on Iwo Jima were placed under U.S. control. Within weeks, crippled B-29 bombers began emergency landings there. More than 400 aircraft would touch those runways by war's end. 27,000 airmen lived to see home they otherwise would have lost over the Pacific. The island had become a sanctuary for life in war. Strategically, Iwo Jima served as a stepping stone closer to Japan. It tightened the noose around the Japanese home islands. But it also exposed the cost of invasion, the casualty ratios, the risk, the sacrifice so starkly that many in American high command would see it as a warning. The price paid there echoed in the decisions that followed. For Japan, the loss was crushing yet dignified. Kuribayashi's strategy had delayed the inevitable, but he had hoped to make the cost so great that it would shake the resolve of the invader. He failed to stop the fall of Iwo, but he succeeded in turning it into a fortress of legend. His soldiers died knowing they would not survive, but that their stand would be remembered. But victory here did not erase pain. The U.S. Navy lost several ships to kamikaze attacks launched from afar. The USS Bismarck Sea was sunk. Countless landing craft and escort vessels were damaged. Many sailors drowned in burning seas, their names lost to waves. On shore, the beaches were littered with twisted armor, shattered supply lines, broken dreams. In the silence that followed, military engineers and Seabees began their relentless work, clearing debris, building revetments, paving runways. They worked under the ghost of battle, among unburied dead, with ash beneath their boots and memories ahead. Within weeks, life came anew to that black island, planes, supplies, airmen, all marching over the ground that had once been staggered by fire. Veterans who returned would say the island felt smaller than memory, yet heavier in spirit. They said they never stopped hearing echoes, the hammering of shells, the hiss of flamethrowers, the cries of the wounded. They said that even when the skull craters cooled, the earth still throbbed beneath their feet. The legacy of Iwo Jima is not in white monuments or black and white photographs. It is in the lessons burned into the minds of planners, soldiers, and civilians. It taught that even with overwhelming force, war could be swallowed by terrain and tenacity. That defeat was not just in surrender, but in refusing to adapt. That small innovations born from desperation could change the course of battles. That courage was not enough without invention. Some names echo through time: Kuribayashi, Holland, Smith, the Marine regiments, the Seabees. But there were thousands more unknown: a welder who stayed at his torch past exhaustion, a corporal who ordered forward when the line wavered, a medic who crawled into the ash for one more life. Those voices are part of this island's soul. The flag remains the symbol. We see 6 men raising the stars and stripes atop Suribachi. But behind that image were tens of thousands who died trying. The island still stands scorched and silent, a reminder of what war demands and what memory yields. Because history is not made only by generals or headlines. It is shaped by the hands that refuse to stop when everything burns. The price is always higher than the cost. And so Iwo Jima stays silent in the wind, scarred by fire, crowned by memory. Under that flag, under those scars, the dead whisper, "We were here, we paid, remember." Because some lessons are written in smoke and steel, others in silence.